The crane was already moving when Leonard Grayson warned them to shut the site down. Nobody listened. Workers welded steel 40 feet above his field, while concrete trucks rolled through the gate behind them. First National Bank had already committed $1.2 million to the tower. And by that point, they believed nothing on earth could stop it. Least of all, a 71-year-old farmer standing alone at the fence line. Leonard never raised his voice. He never threatened anybody. 3 weeks earlier, he had mailed the bank a single handwritten warning. 1 page. No lawyer. No demands. Just a warning about what was underneath that construction site. The bank's legal department barely looked at it. Then they mailed him a form response and approved another week of digging. By the end of that same day, workers had drilled even deeper into the ground Leonard warned them about. And every morning after that, Leonard came back to the fence and watched them keep digging. Not the tower. The ground beneath it. To understand why the bank felt untouchable, you have to understand how fast this project moved. 12 months earlier, First National Bank had taken control of more than 300 acres of farmland through a foreclosure settlement. The land itself meant nothing to them, but the location did. A regional telecom company wanted a tower there, and once the telecom deal was signed, everything started moving fast. County permits were approved with almost no resistance. The environmental survey came back clean. No protected land, no historical markers, no burial records, nothing that could slow construction down. By August, heavy equipment was already rolling onto the property. By September, concrete had been poured into the foundation site. The local newspaper called the project a major upgrade for rural cell service across 3 counties. County officials praised it publicly. One commissioner described it as exactly the kind of progress this area needs. And with every passing week, the bank grew more confident. Steel arrived on flatbeds. Crews worked 6 days a week. The crane went up on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, workers were already climbing the frame. Meanwhile, Leonard Grayson kept showing up at the fence line. Quietly. Every morning. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Watching the same patch of ground beneath the tower. Sometimes he brought old papers with him. Sometimes he just stood there with his hands in his pockets. Most workers figured he was just angry about the tower. The bank barely thought about him at all. After all, Leonard had no lawyer, no paperwork, and no official standing in the project. Just a warning nobody wanted to take seriously. And by the time construction reached full speed, nobody had bothered asking why he kept coming back. The crew noticed him first. Not the bank, not the project manager, the workers. Because when you spend 10 hours a day on a construction site, you notice anything that doesn't belong. The same truck parked at the same fence every morning. The same old man standing there for hours, not watching the crane, not watching the tower, watching the ground beneath it. One of the younger workers mentioned it to the foreman during the second week. Ray told him not to worry about it. But Ray had already noticed something strange himself. Leonard never looked angry. He never looked nervous. He looked familiar with that land, like a man staring at something he'd known his entire life. Around day 11, a worker clearing brush along the western edge of the site turned up a stone. Flat, rectangular, too clean to look natural. The worker kicked it aside and mentioned it to Ray later that evening. That night, Ray drove back to the site alone. He found the stone with a flashlight and crouched beside it in the dark. Maybe it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. Ray left the stone where it was. He didn't report it. He didn't call the bank, but after that night, he started paying closer attention to where Leonard stood every morning. The next day, during lunch, Ray finally walked over to him. He asked Leonard what he kept staring at through the fence. Leonard didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "My family farmed this land before your bank ever heard of it." That was all he said, but something about the way he said it stayed with Ray. Later that same week, one of the older workers mentioned his grandfather used to talk about several homesteads that once stood along that stretch of land before the county rerouted the road decades earlier. Families that slowly disappeared over the years. Nobody asked the obvious question, where did those families bury their dead? Lunch ended. The crane kept moving. The tower kept rising. Then, near the western edge of the site, two workers noticed something else. The survey stakes didn't quite line up with the original markers from the permit filing. Not by much, just enough to feel wrong. Nobody reported it. The project was already ahead of schedule, and as far as the bank was concerned, everything was going perfectly. But 30 feet inside the western perimeter, right where Leonard stopped every single morning, the ground still hadn't been excavated yet. On the morning of day 17, a second excavator arrived on site. Bigger than the first, wider bucket, built for deeper excavation. The project had finally reached the western perimeter, the same stretch of ground Leonard had been watching every morning for over 2 weeks. Ray stood near the site trailer with a cup of coffee and watched the machine roll off the flatbed. He didn't say anything. He just watched. A few minutes later, Leonard arrived at the fence line. The moment he saw the second excavator, he went completely still. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Ray couldn't hear the conversation, but Leonard didn't look surprised. He looked like a man whose timeline had just moved up. Excavation along the western edge began that morning. At first, everything looked normal. Topsoil, clay, compacted gravel from old farm drainage. Nothing unusual. The excavator operator was a quiet man named Dex. He'd been running heavy equipment for almost 20 years. Around midday, Dex suddenly slowed the machine. Not enough for most people to notice, but Ray noticed. He walked over and asked if something was wrong. Dex shook his head. "Ground feels different over here." Then he kept digging. Ray looked down into the trench. The soil coming up now was darker, denser, layered differently than the surrounding earth. And for the first time since construction began, Ray stopped feeling certain Leonard was wrong. That afternoon, Ray drove to the county records office during lunch. He pulled the permit survey and the environmental report tied to the project. Everything looked clean. Too clean. The environmental review had been approved without a full site inspection. Ray stared at the paperwork, longer than he meant to, then drove back to the site without saying a word. The next morning, the bank's regional vice president arrived with telecom executives and photographers. They walked the property in spotless hard hats, talking about lease revenue, expansion plans, and rural infrastructure. As far as the bank was concerned, everything was going perfectly. 40 feet away, Dex sat silently inside the excavator, staring down into the trench. That afternoon, he climbed down from the machine and told Ray he needed to leave early. The next morning, he called in sick. It was the first sick day he'd taken in 4 years. Ray barely slept that night. Before sunrise the next morning, he returned to the site alone and walked the western perimeter himself. He stopped beside the excavation trench and studied the exposed layers of earth running through the cut wall. Different soil, different layers, ground that no longer looked untouched. Ray wasn't an archaeologist, but he had spent 30 years working in the dirt and standing there in the silence before sunrise. He realized something that made his stomach tighten. This ground had been opened once before, a long time ago, and then closed again. Ray slowly looked toward the road. Leonard's truck was already there. Leonard was already standing at the fence, watching the same patch of ground. Ray pulled out his phone. Then he searched for the number of the State Archaeological Survey Office and saved it. Ray called the State Archaeological Survey Office on a Thursday morning. He sat in his truck near the access road with the engine off and dialed the number he'd saved 4 days earlier. He got a recording, left a short message, then went back to work. That same morning, the project manager arrived with news from the telecom company. The installation deadline had been moved forward by 3 weeks. Every delay now had a dollar figure attached to it. A few hours later, the bank released a public statement claiming the foundation phase was already ahead of schedule. But the western perimeter still wasn't finished, and everyone on site knew it. By that point, the project had become too public to slow down easily. Dex returned to work on day 22. Just after 11, he suddenly stopped the excavator in the middle of a pass, climbed down, and walked over to Ray. "I need you to come look at something." The two men stood at the edge of the trench together. Dex pointed toward a dark circular discoloration running through the exposed soil wall. Too clean, too deliberate. Ray stared at it silently. Dex finally said, "I've seen that before. Site in Missouri. They shut the whole thing down." Ray told him to photograph the area and stay away from that section of ground for now. Later that day, Leonard walked to the site entrance for the first time since construction began. Ray met him near the gate. Leonard looked at him and quietly asked, "How deep are you on the west side now?" Ray told him. Leonard closed his eyes briefly, then said, "You need to stop that equipment today." Ray asked him why. This time, Leonard answered, "My grandmother drew me a map when I was 9 years old." He looked toward the excavation trench. "And everything on that map is exactly where your machines are digging right now." Then he turned around and walked back to his truck. That afternoon, the State Archaeological Survey Office finally called Ray back. A senior archaeologist listened quietly while Ray described the stone, the disturbed soil, and the darker layers beneath the western perimeter. Then she asked one question. "Is excavation still active?" Ray looked across the site. Workers were still welding steel above the tower frame. Concrete trucks were still rolling through the gate. The bank was still moving forward, like nothing was wrong. Ray answered quietly, "Yes." There was a long pause on the line. Then the archaeologist told him Western excavation should probably stop immediately until a formal assessment could be completed. Ray thanked her and hung up, but he didn't stop the project officially. Instead, he quietly told Dex to hold Western excavation work and blame the delay on equipment problems if anyone asked. Dex shut the excavator down at 3 p.m. and left the site early. A few minutes later, the project manager called over the radio asking why the machine was sitting idle. Ray blamed a hydraulic issue. The manager sounded irritated, but he accepted the answer. And by that point, someone from the State Archaeological Survey Office already had the site address. Dr. Marsh arrived just after 7 in the morning. No announcement, no urgency, just a state vehicle pulling quietly onto the access road before most of the crew had finished their first coffee. Ray met her at the gate and walked her straight to the western perimeter. She unpacked a ground-penetrating radar unit and started scanning the same stretch of ground Leonard had been watching for nearly a month. Nobody started their equipment. The crew just watched from a distance. Then, on the fourth scan, Dr. Marsh stopped. She stared at the screen for several seconds, then reached into her field kit and pushed a small orange flag into the ground. A few feet away, she placed another. Then, another. By the seventh flag, Dex had already climbed down from the excavator. Two other workers quietly stepped away from the trench. Nobody said much. They didn't need to. The project manager arrived at 8:15 and immediately saw the flags, the idle machinery, and the state vehicle parked near the fence. Ray handed him Dr. Marsh's preliminary report. The manager scanned the report silently. Dr. Marsh explained her findings calmly. Disturbed soil patterns. Possible burial sites beneath the western perimeter. Under state law, all excavation inside the affected zone was suspended immediately pending a full assessment. The project manager asked how long that would take. Dr. Marsh answered honestly. It depends what we find. At 8:41, the project manager called the bank. A few minutes later, he walked back across the site and told the crew to stand down. Then, at 8:53, the crane stopped moving. Because on an active construction site, the crane is the last thing to stop. And when the crane stops, the project stops with it. The steel arm hung motionless above the western perimeter, above the orange flags. Above the ground, Leonard Grayson had been watching every single morning for 26 days. At 9:15, a sheriff's deputy arrived and taped off the excavation zone. No lights, no sirens, just one quiet sentence to the project manager. Nobody touches that ground. By 9:30, the site was completely silent. Equipment frozen where it last ran. Concrete trucks parked by the gate. $1.2 million. Stopped. Not by a lawsuit, not by a protest, by 7 small orange flags, and by one old farmer who never raised his voice once. Leonard was still standing at the fence when the final engine shut down. He looked at the flags. At the same patch of ground his grandmother had drawn on a map more than 60 years earlier. And for the first time since construction began, the land was finally quiet again. The tower is still there. Nobody tore it down. Nobody finished it either. The steel frame still stands over the western perimeter, exactly where construction stopped that morning. Half-built, silent, like a project that ran out of answers. The bank never held a press conference. Their only public statement called the shutdown a temporary regulatory review. After that, they stopped talking. The county later opened a formal investigation into how the environmental survey had been approved without a full site inspection. That investigation is still ongoing. Ray returned to the site 6 weeks later to collect the last of the equipment. Most of the machinery was already gone. Leonard was standing at the fence again. Same spot as always. Ray walked over quietly. For a moment, neither man said anything. Then Ray looked toward the unfinished tower and said, "I should have stopped it sooner." Leonard looked at him for a long moment, then answered quietly, "You stopped it." That was all. The archaeological assessment later confirmed 9 burial sites beneath the western perimeter. The oldest dated back to the 1800s. The family name matched the church records, and it matched Leonard's. He never gave interviews, never spoke to reporters. A month later, workers passing the property noticed a simple black iron fence surrounding the marked ground. Nothing decorative, just 4 posts and a gate. Near the corner of the fence, Leonard planted a small oak tree. It will take decades to fully grow. Leonard knew that when he planted it. He planted it anyway, and long after the trucks left, long after the crane stopped moving, that piece of land remained untouched. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. Next week, a bank approved a highway expansion through an abandoned ranch in Texas. 3 days later, someone found the original county boundary markers.